Just to get us started, could you tell us about the title and how you chose such a perfect title, and whether there was any debate in your publishing house whether this would be the title?
There was.
Okay.
One of the things I wanted to do with this book is show that our notions of class have a much longer and older history. And I take it all the way back to the British colonial period, in part because even though we tell ourselves that the American Revolution, we left Great Britain, we got rid of the aristocracy, in fact, none of that is true. We borrowed a great deal from British and English culture. And two of the concepts that are sort of central to where white trash comes from is, first of all, since we have been an agrarian nation for over half our history, it's important to pay attention to rural ways of thinking about class. And the idea of white trash actually was first used by Richard Hakluyt, who was an Elizabethan adventurer who made a pitch to Queen Elizabeth about why we needed the New World. And the real reason that he felt the New World was important is that it was going to be the trash bin for the poor and the idle and the worthless people in England. Now, this, of course, upsets the apple cart on the idea that somehow everyone who came to the New World were seeking religious liberty. It's not true. Most people were coming for economic reasons, and the word that was used by Richard Hakluyt to describe these people was waste people. So therefore, the idea of trash, Thomas Jefferson Abigail Adams referred to the rural white population as rubbish. Now, we still hear that. British people still use that term today. But part of what I was trying to uncover is that two big concepts that we need to think about still shape our class system today. One is the idea of land and the importance of the civic value and the economic value and the class value of being a landowner. And this is important because one of the things that we have to realize is that even in the early founding period, you couldn't vote unless you owned land. And land, in a sense, was seen as the real source of liberty. You had to be a landowner. So land, and if we think about why land continued to be associated with the poor were very much fashioned as either being seen as people who lived on land that was considered wasteland, because that's where waste people came from. Wasteland is land that's left untilled and fallow and is unproductive. So therefore, the waste people throughout American history end up being associated with unproductive land. For example, the term redneck is identified as being associated with people who live in swamps. At the same time, hillbillies are associated with people who live in the hills and are seen as poor. So land that's unproductive is the source of one important definition for understanding class identity. The other important theme that I highlight, which we also inherited from the British, is the idea of breeding. And this is really important because this is the idea that one's class identity is passed from one generation to the next. This connects to pedigree, lineage, and the fact that for the British and for early Americans and Americans in general, one of the things that we don't pay attention to is that class is not just only about property ownership or the labor value of the job you have. It's also very much linked to breeding and even your children. Children were a measure of the class identity and class status of individuals because the poor children were always seen as unhealthy, poorly clothed, poorly fed. And by the time the term white trash appears, which is in the 1820s, at that moment, poor whites and white trash are now being associated with two other rather disturbing terms for the poor, which were clay eaters and sandhillers. Sandhillers, again, they lived on worthless sand. Clay eaters is where they were seen as not even being white. They were seen as having the skin color, a yellowish tint to their skin color that was compared to parchment. And part of the reason they had this disease is it's pellagra, but in the 1820s, 1840s, no one identified this. This doesn't get identified until the early 20th century. So when we think about class, we have to return to the importance of breeding, inheritance, and this is also why, as I trace my history, the other important thing to think about, and this unfortunately is still part of our history today, the other group that the English despised were vagrants. So the poor, in a sense, are always associated with people who don't put down roots, who aren't property owners, who are seen as people who are always on the move, people who, and this is actually even used today as a rationale for dealing with the poor. You might all be familiar with Kevin Williamson. He wrote for the National Review. When he wrote a very hostile essay attacking Trump supporters, he not only attacked them for living in dying cities and towns, and also used another favorite trope, referred to their critique as a yelping dog. But then he went on to say that, well, if you're poor, all you have to do is pack your bags and move. And this is, this idea of mobility continues to be a part of white trash identity, because in the late 19th century, there were cracker carts, because cracker is another important term for poor whites. And if we think about trailer trash, that's a house on wheels. That's a home, that's a place you live that never gets the same, it's never really seen as a home, because it's seen as again, people who are on the move, people who are not real property owners. So if you can go away from tonight thinking about several things that continue to be a part of our class identity. One is the way it's passed from parent to child, and that's even true for sociologists. They have found in 2015 the most important predictor of being successful in this country is linked to the wealth and privilege that you get from not only your parents, but your ancestors. So lineage and this idea of inheritance is still very much a part of our class definition. The other is this idea of breeding. Breeding is not only the way we might think of it in a positive term, as acquiring taste or skills. It also, for white trash, it was seen as an imposed identity, something you literally inherited, and that's why I have a great deal to say about the eugenics movement and how incredibly popular that was. Everyone subscribed to this ideology. Professors at Harvard, leading politicians like Teddy Roosevelt. As you know, the major institute for studying eugenics was in New York, was in Long Island. Charles Davenport was the head of that. So these three concepts, mobility, vagrancy, breeding, pedigree, land, and property, I think still continue to be extremely important ways for how we sort and divide people, because class isn't just about the money you earn, it isn't just about your job and the status. It's also bodily. It's also seen as the way you appear, and that's why white trash were always seen as, children who are barefoot, diseased, and that this is sort of the dark side of class that really did define this cultural pattern that gets reinvented as the terms get reinvented across history and time.
Well, so I'll come back to the fight you had with your publisher, discussion you had with your publisher about the title. But Frank, I wanted to ask you to speak to this issue about mobility, the idea really that we have of America as a place of liberty and mobility. I mean, where what Nancy is saying is that the mobility is actually in many ways an illusion, and white trash is a term that coheres around mobility or lack thereof. So if you could speak about the illusions that we live under, really, in terms of the American dream itself, the idea of the American dream.
Right. Well, I think, in this terrific book, I have to say, those who haven't read it should read it, because this is a part of history we were talking before coming on that just has been, it's one of several things in American history that have been neglected. I mean, we know certain stories have been neglected, minority group stories until recently and so on. But this cuts right across from the earliest settlements to the present day, and also another thing in the book that's fascinating is how it's also rooted in pop culture throughout. The Tobacco Road to the Beverly Hillbillies and everything in between. Yes, of course, this idea of complete freedom is an illusion, and it's something that politicians in particular like to sell. And really, probably it's Janis Joplin who had it right. I mean, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. But still, it was Chris Christopherson. That's right. Chris Christopherson wrote it, right? She sang it. He sang it, but he wrote it. And so a lot of this is completely rooted in our creation as a country and remains that way. And indeed, the Kevin Williamson piece is one of several pieces by conservatives, including, I would argue, Hillbilly Elegy, that memoir, Charles Murray, the conservative scholar. They all basically say, why can't you be like me and get up and go?
Right.
And Williamson, rent a U-Haul and just leave.
Right.
And so even people who are politically sympathetic in a way to how current lower class or working class whites vote still think, what's wrong with you? Freedom is there. It's there to be taken, and it has nothing to do, there's nothing stopping you, not the issues of pedigree and all the issues you discuss in this book that have been there from the beginning. It's just everyone has this opportunity. And then, of course, the political, this is beyond the purview of what we're discussing about, but then, of course, somewhat ironically, I guess, a lot of people who are stuck in these, in this economic plight and don't have the freedom of complete mobility, then assume that immigrants are somehow getting everything they're not. By the way, and another theme that's in the book that I'd like to hear you talk more about, Nancy, is that also people who do escape it historically then shut the door on those behind them and just assume, why can't it, and this goes back to a whole generation that was helped by the New Deal, helped during the Depression, as you describe, and then turn against the safety net and shut the door to that freedom.
Right. Yeah, two things. I mean, if we think for example, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, you've all heard of them. Their argument was not actually about promising mobility up the class ladder. What they claimed was going to change the class structure was the size of the continent. And what they promised was horizontal mobility, not upward mobility. But even Franklin, in a sense, was kind of as harsh as Kevin Williamson. Basically, he believed that if the poor were drawn into the West, that the ones who would succeed, who worked hard, had large families, that they, in a sense, would not only succeed, but that if they didn't succeed, he basically said, well, your option was to move on or die. And that's the thing I always like to remind people how the British thought about the poor. The British said that in the colonial period, there were 4 options about what would happen to the poor. First of all, they would die from starvation or disease. Second of all, they would be arrested and end up dying on the gallows or be executed. Third of all, they'd be sent off to fight wars and die.